Okay, so today we are going to talk about evolution by natural selection, which is a really important process. It's a foundation for all of biological sciences. We'll talk about that at the very end. Um, the readings are marginally relevant to what we'll be talking about. Um, I'm going to go ahead and take things in my own direction. This is the area of my expertise. So far, we've talked about evolution in a couple of contexts. I wanted you to generally be aware that when we say evolution, there are lots of ways in which it could be used. And in other words, you could say that if you think about the changes that have occurred in life, in the array of living organisms that has been in existence on the surface of the Earth for the entire time since life began, around 3.5, 3.6 billion years ago, that is evolution. And evolution is most directly identified as the actual change that has occurred, right? Or the process by which the change has, actually the process by which evolution occurs is the evolutionary process, and that's also considered to be evolution, right? When you have a change, that which has happened, and the process by which the change occurs are two ways that we think of evolution and two ways in which we use the term. Okay? When we're thinking about the actual processes, there are actually many processes that we could be talking about. At one level, you could talk about microevolutionary process versus macroevolution. Not something that we want to get into with BIO110, but within microevolution or within macroevolution, there are many other mechanisms and sub-processes that we could be talking about. The one thing that has made the greatest impact on biology, though, is one of the microevolutionary processes, and that is evolution by natural selection, right? And so this is the one that Charles Darwin gave us, and it's the one that I would like you to be able to explain to your neighbor, to your aunt, uncle, best friend, okay? Whoever it is that needs the Darwinian model explained to them. You should be able to do that as the result of having taken this class, okay? Now remember, we think of science as being something that explains, that offers an explanation that's supported and is understandable based on things that you can see in the natural universe, right? And so we're thinking about, well, the Darwinian model has to be explaining something. What is it that's being explained? It's a good place to start, right? Okay. So think about that. Well, what is it that we need to explain with the mechanism of Darwin, which is evolution by natural selection? Well, you could say we need to explain the change, right? The way that populations change over time. Right? Because we know that populations don't remain static and the same throughout all of eternity, because we've got evidence from the fossil record that the organisms that we have today were not there when fossils were deposited 10,000 years ago, 10 million years ago, 100 million years ago. Yeah, at some point in the past, our species didn't exist. There was an ancestral species, which ultimately became our species, but the organisms that we identify as humans today would not have been present at a time earlier. Whatever our ancestors were, they had to have changed over that amount of time to get to where they are today, right? You could say, well, yeah, Darwin needs to explain that, but more than that. So, okay, the other thing that is important about the Darwinian mechanism is that it explains the process of adaptation. Okay? The fact that you think organisms are very well fit to what it is they need to do in their ecologies, right? Why is it that structure matches up with function, right? Why is it that a squid's tentacles are so good at grabbing onto fish and other prey items that the squid is trying to eat? Well, if the squid didn't have those tentacles, it wouldn't be very successful. It might have died out. But basically, the fact that squids are really good at doing what squids have to do is the adaptation. You know? And if you think about that, this is, in my mind, why um, you know, the Darwinian mechanism kind of steps on the toes of established religions, because religions are based on the idea that there's some kind of benevolent creator that made things the way they are because that's the way that they had to be. They were intelligently designed. Okay, that's a buzzword all on its own. But the intelligence that would be required to make a squid as good as a squid is doesn't need to be there, because we've got a process, the Darwinian mechanism of natural selection, which leads to adapted states of organisms, because being adapted is what's required in order for organisms to persist and to leave offspring. Okay, so I mean, question one, what is being explained? Well, there are two parts. The fact that populations do change over time, and maybe even most importantly, why organisms have this high state of suitability to their ecologies, why it is that they are so well suited to what they need to do in the world. Okay, so that's what's being explained. Does the Darwinian model explain it? Yes, it does. That's kind of like why he developed this model. Right? What's the proposed explanation? This is the part that is actually pretty simple, right? We've talked about it already. I mean, I think I've given you the Darwinian model already at a few points, maybe a couple of times already this semester, just in the few videos that I've made for you so far. Okay, the idea, it's based on three ideas. I call them three conditions: A, B, and C. You need to have variability. T in the population. Right? You have to have some organisms that are taller, some are the shorter, some with longer arms, some with shorter arms. This is an absolute necessity. If you don't have organisms that are different from each other, then you don't have anything for selection to favor, right? If we are all the same height, how could natural selection change that? By selecting the taller ones, because there aren't any taller ones, right? So one idea that I like to present is that you can just break evolution by natural selection down into three very simple ideas. Right? The second thing says that you have to select. That's kind of that's kind of like a redundancy. But by selection, I mean some organisms have to survive and reproduce. There has to be a differential in survival and reproduction, right? Because if you don't survive and you don't reproduce, you're not going to have any offspring in the next generation, right? And whatever your characteristic traits are, they're going to die. And so the organisms that are able to survive and reproduce are the ones that are going to have their characteristics represented in the next generation. And the next generation is going to look more like the survivors and reproducers than they are like the individuals in the population that died without surviving and reproducing, right? So yeah, I think this is kind of obviously a requirement. We have to have variability because there has to be some differences among the organisms to select. And the third thing that we have to have is inheritance. Inheritance, heritability. If you have a successful characteristic, if you have a long beak, and long beaks are good, and you survive and have lots of babies because your long beak allowed you to get lots of food, you want to be able to pass that long beak characteristic onto your offspring, because if you can't pass that on, then it's not going. Then what happens? This generation is not going to have any influence on future generations. We have to have the inheritance of whatever characteristic that is variable and is being selected in the population. And that's easy enough for you to understand as well, right? Because if you are a tall person, the chances are pretty good your parents were on the tall side. If you are a dark-haired person, the chances are that your offspring are going to be dark-haired more than they're likely to be light-haired. There are going to be lots of exceptions to this because that's the nature of the way that inheritance actually works. Talk about this later on. But the idea that characteristics that we show are, we call them phenotypes, are inheritable is something that I don't think requires a whole lot of explanation. Now, you could actually demonstrate all three of these points to third graders, and they'd be able to understand any one of these 3 points on their own. But what Darwin says is that if you have differences among the organisms in the population, and some of them are going to be surviving and reproducing disproportionately to population as a whole, basically if they're particularly good at surviving and reproducing, then they're going to be having their characteristics present in the next generation, provided that you've got inheritance. And by doing this, we'll see the population change from generation 1 to generation 2, from generation 2 to generation 3. And this is the mechanism by which we end up explaining the things that Darwin needed to explain, right? So this is evolution by natural selection. This is what evolution by natural selection is explaining. And it's a really basic model that has great power because it is so easily understood and so easily, it's also very easy to support with observation and as well as with experimentation, right? We talked about that before. We said that it's kind of difficult to do experiments on long-lived organisms like elephants, so you might not be able to demonstrate evolutionary change from generation to generation in elephants unless you were living to an age of 10,000 years. I mean, maybe if your lifespan was that long, you might be able to detect something in your long-term study. But if you're looking at short-lived organisms like mice or like birds, okay, you can actually demonstrate that evolution by natural selection causes change in populations, right? Now, I mentioned that this is an example of a microevolutionary force because we're looking at one generation's worth of change explained as a result of what happens in one generation of selection with variability and heritability going along with that selection, right? Now the key piece to make this work, to understand the broad expanse of life's diversity, is to be able to picture this process taking place in time frames that are far beyond what we're used to thinking about, right? I mean, it's a relatively understandable point that as humans, there's a particular range of times that we can relate to. We understand days, we understand weeks, we understand years, because these are time frames that we're used to having things happen to ourselves, okay? But it's hard for us to even conceive of what could happen over 100 years' time, right? 100 years' time is a vast amount of time for us. Because it kind of stretches our, it stretches us well beyond what we're used to having to think about on a daily basis, right? But 100 years is nothing in the evolutionary picture, because remember, the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old, which means you've got, 460, that would make it 46 million 100-year time frames to work with in the lifespan of the Earth, right? And this is beyond what most people can think about comfortably. But if you're able to stretch your mind out and say, okay, well, I can think about these small changes occurring generation after generation. They accumulate over thousands or 10,000s or hundreds of thousands of generations, and they lead to really large-scale evolutionary change, right? And so, yeah, I mean, maybe another key piece to making this work in your own mind is to take this relatively simple idea that a population will be changing from 2022 to 2023 and saying, well, between 2022 and 10,000, 12,022, in other words, 10,000 years, right? We could actually be seeing a really large amount of change happening, right, in that species. Right? And yeah, I mean, if you look at these three mechanisms scaled up over thousands of generations or 10,000s of generations, it becomes a relatively easy thing for you to picture that this is a very powerful mechanism to explain the natural universe, the biological universe on Earth, right? So I told you at the very beginning that I would explain to you why it is that this particular model, scientific model, remember, it's subject to validation from observation. It's still falsifiable. You could demonstrate that it doesn't work for a particular case. This is all, very, very much within the realm of what falls under science. This is actually a foundational piece to pretty much all of biology. Everything that's related to living organisms is going to have to be consistent with the Darwinian model. And we realized this really early on. It's kind of interesting that Darwin published The Origin of Species, where he explained evolution by natural selection in 1859. Okay? The problem with The Origin was that Darwin's understanding of inheritance, okay, was kind of sketchy. We didn't have a good model for understanding why it was or how information got passed on from one generation to the next. This was totally sketchy in Darwin's time. And it prevented a whole, the entire world from realizing that Darwin's model was as powerful as it was, because without inheritance, without this crucial bit of the puzzle, Darwin's model really does not have the explanatory power. Right? I mean, if Darwin knew about Mendelian inheritance, it would have been a different story. I mean, we wouldn't have had any problem with this. But Darwin had kind of like old school ideas of how inheritance worked, and it wasn't panning out to give him a very convincing picture of evolution by natural selection. And you could have variability, you could have selection, but inheritance was all messy, and we didn't get that really clear picture of a process that would be accumulating change over long periods of time. Okay, so I think the sad part is that Mendel's work was actually published in 1850, 9 years before The Origin of Species, and Mendel's work could have illuminated the one piece that was sketchy in Darwin's model, except that nobody read Mendel's work until the early 1900s. Right? Mendel did his work in monasteries somewhere in the Czech Republic, or what is now the Czech Republic, East Prussia, and he published his work in an obscure journal in German, and it wasn't looked at until like after 1900. And it wasn't until another set of people came to realize the importance of Mendel's work and saw that Mendel really got rid of this sketchy aspect of the evolution by natural selection model. That's when we generated this really great example of a synthesis, right? We'll be talking about synthesis later on in a chemical sense, but a synthesis means syn is together. Okay? It's a together thesis. Okay? It's like Darwin's thesis, Darwin's model of evolution by natural selection was really great. It was really good. He had the right idea. Darwin was sure he had the right idea, but it wasn't complete. Right? Mendel's thesis of how characteristics were inherited from generation to generation, it was a beautiful thesis. It explained lots of things, and it also filled the gap. So when you put Darwin and Mendel together, okay, it's kind of like peas and carrots. They go together so well. Peanut butter and jelly. They make what amounts to a complete and super powerful foundation of modern biology. And in fact, it's hardly considered modern, given the fact that it began in 1920. But that's actually true. Between 1920 and 1950, all of these biological sciences, zoology, the study of animals, botany, the study of plants, mycology, the study of fungi, bacteriology, the study of bacteria. We have what we now consider to be biology broken up into the kinds of organisms that were looked at, right? Zoologists didn't have a whole lot to talk about with botanists. They didn't have a lot to talk about with people that studied fungi and people that were looking under microscopes. They're kind of like looking at their own different areas, right? There was nothing uniting them, right? People that were interested in classifying organisms, taxonomy, people that were looking at the way that animals and plants worked, right? People that were, even the people that were studying genetics, because they realized that Mendel's studies was a great starting point for other kinds of replicating work. We have the science of paleontology, fossil organisms, how do they relate to modern organisms? Embryology, the study of things that happen during development. Biometrics, how using a mathematical analysis of biology gives us insight into the relationships between different structures on our body, right? The people that were on a practical end, interested in breeding animals and plants, these were kind of like all their own separate disciplines, right? What is it that caused these separate disciplines to merge into the biological sciences? As an integrated, all-inclusive fabric? Well, there really has to be some overarching umbrella mechanism, and that mechanism is evolution by natural selection, right? It's like this. Once we have the synthesis of Darwin and Mendel, all these areas, all these different areas of biology, they kind of migrate, they kind of redefine themselves, and they migrate to a common point, okay? And they become this integrated edifice of biological sciences. It's just one thing now. There are several subdisciplines within the biological sciences, but they're all united by the fact that the things that occur within them have taken shape as a result of this really powerful explanatory mechanism of evolution by natural selection. So don't let anybody tell you, oh yeah, that's some obscure topic that I had to learn about when I took a biology class. No, it's not an obscure topic. The fact that biology has gotten as far as it has is in large part by virtue of this interaction and intermingling of minds that has only been possible since it was recognized that we are all doing the same kind of thing. All right, we'll talk more on this topic later on, but that's enough for today.